Hello and welcome to Skills in Automation. My name is Ash and today we are going to look at a solution to a behind the scenes issue that I have. While I enjoy making these YouTube videos, creating realistic data sets for them gets a bit painful. So in this video, we are going to look at how to create a rich data set at the push of a button using the random function in VBA. While the use case for this project might be rather specific, there are a lot of creative data manipulation tricks showcased in this video that might be worth your while. Okay, let's move on to the demo. We want to create a data set of 5,000 open or rather unpaid invoices from the past 2 years. There are some rules that we want to follow, but for the most part, we're going to use the random function in some form to help generate each field. This first sheet is blank. There's only a header row. There are a few lists in the supporting sheet. Let's go to the code, Alt F11. Let's run the macro, hit play, go back to our sheet, and we have our results. 5,000 lines of rule-based randomized data created from thin air. We could just as easily create 10,000 or even 100,000 rows. Next, let's look at each column one by one. Here, we'll get an understanding of what the rule requirements are for each field. First is the date. Each date is a randomly generated date that lies between today and a date that's 2 years before today. Next, we have the CRM invoice number. It's a 6-digit randomly generated number, but while the dates from the previous column can repeat on different lines, we need to make sure that each invoice number is unique. So that's a bit of additional complexity. Next, we have the store name. Now, there is a supporting sheet called random list. Here, we can see a column with 10 of our company stores. We need to pick any one store and randomly assign it to each invoice. Next is the customer code. It looks like a fancy code, but in fact, just the last 4 digits are randomly generated, and the first part of the string is a constant. Next is the original invoice amount. This is any whole number between 5,000 and 20,000. Next is the open amount. This is a bit interesting. So, these are unpaid or partially paid invoices. That is, there is a non-zero open amount against them. Next, we have the ERP invoice number. This is an 8-digit unique random alphanumeric string. We'll be creating an interesting function for that. And lastly, we have the source and the CRM reference code, which will follow the same logic as the store name. That is, we're going to randomly select a value from each of this list on a supporting sheet. The focus of this video is on how to randomly generate data that is bound by some logic. So while we deep dive on an intermediate level into the randomization of data, we'll take some shortcuts on the overall macro approach. The shortcuts namely are related to the hard coding of data. For example, these column names are hard-coded, and some logic within the code is hard-coded as well. This will make a final macro slightly less dynamic. The reason here is that I don't want to dilute the message of this video by overcomplicating the code. Okay, moving on, let's look at the random function. As per the Microsoft Docs page, the random function returns a value less than 1 but greater than or equal to 0. More accurately though, we usually get a decimal number between 0 and 1, and occasionally we will get 0. Let's go to the VB editor and print out some examples. Let's create a function, and we'll just print out the output of the random function in the immediate window. So, debug.print, play this out. Okay, these decimals by themselves are not of much use. Let's first multiply it with 1,000. Now we are getting somewhere. This is returning a decimal number between 0 and 1,000. But we don't really need the decimal portion. Let's convert it to a whole number using the integer function. So we'll wrap our previous output inside the integer function. Play this out. Okay, we can use this to generate valid random numbers. But for a more realistic scenario, let's bound this number within certain limits. Let's restrict the lower bound to 10,000 and the upper bound to 19,999. We're going to use the same function that's on the Microsoft page. So we'll be using this function. Let's place this after our debug.print. And let's replace the lower bound by 10,000. And the upper bound by 19,999. What we're doing here is taking the lower bound and adding a randomized value to it. But we are restricting the total sum to not exceed the upper bound. Let's run this code. It's the first result. Let's run it again and again and again and again. And this can go on forever. It'll keep giving us a value between 10,000 and 19,999. Awesome. We are going to actually use this exact code when we generate our invoice numbers. Let's now generate random uppercase alphabets that we will use in our alphanumeric strings. For this, we need the character function. This function returns a character that is associated with a certain code. As we can see out here, the uppercase alphabets start from code 65 through to 90. So let's feed this back into our function. So the lower bound is 65, 65 as well, and 90. Clear this output, run it. Yep. So this is giving us a code. Now we need to return the character associated with that code. To achieve that, let's wrap our output within the character function. So chr and hit run. Great. K, W, U, J. Fantastic. So that works well. And that's all the basics that we need to know. Let's start building our main code for our actual project. Here we have the basic setup. On sheet unpaid invoices, we have our column headers for the data that we are about to generate. And on the sheet random list, we have 3 separate lists which correspond to 3 separate columns on our data sheet. Let's go to our VBA editor, Alt F11, create a new module. We'll rename this to random numbers, create a new sub. We will use the worksheet names to refer to the worksheets. This will allow us to directly refer to the worksheet without creating a separate worksheet object. You can see the worksheet names right here in the Project Explorer, and you can assign the worksheet names by going into the Properties window. Moving on, let's clear out the body of the invoice worksheet. So before we run the macro, we want to clear out this area, which is row 2 onwards. So the worksheet name. We can also set the number formats for each column. The first column will have dates. So we'll set the number format to DDMMYY. Then the columns B to F will have just a general format. Column G, which is the ERP invoice number, will be alphanumeric. So we'll set it as text. And the rest of the columns are general format as well. Let's assign 2 variables to hold the random values. One will be long and one will be string to hold text. And once we're done with the macro, we'll just auto fit all the columns to make everything look nice and tidy. Okay, let's create a for loop. First, we'll assign an iteration variable. The idea is to create 5,000 lines of data. So the loop will run from the second to row 5001. Now this is the bit of hard coding that I mentioned in the disclaimers at the start. We are hard coding this to 5001. Ideally, we would set this as a variable and set it somewhere right at the top or on the main worksheet so that we don't have to come into the code and change this value each time we want to increase the rows. Okay, before we move to building the main code, let's build 2 functions first. The first function will be to generate a random number. Let's create a new module. Call this functions. Our first function is going to give us a random number between the lower bound and the upper bound that we specify. So we'll be creating a function for this formula similar to the one that we saw earlier. And the reasoning for creating a separate function is that we'll be calling this formula many times in our main code. So let's create the function. It will take the lower bound number and the upper bound number as parameters. And we'll set this function to return the result of this formula. Okay, first let's test this out. We'll just debug.print it in our main code. I'm just going to put a code break here and run the main code and iterate over this. Okay, no worries. That's what you get for copying and pasting directly. I'm just going to click OK out here. These variables are got an F in front of them. This should work. And we get 7, which is correct. Run this once again just to be on the safe side. 5. That is cool, and that is working. Cool. Let's now create a second function to return an alphanumeric string. Now this function is going to return an alphanumeric string for a certain length that we are going to specify within the parameter of the function. Let's create the function. And we'll pass in the string length as parameter. We will loop over the length of the string. For every iteration of the loop, we will find a random alphanumeric value using the character function that we saw earlier on. First, let's assign an iteration variable. We will assign some variables that we'll use later. We'll address these as we reach that part of the code. Let's create a for loop to loop over the string. So we're going to loop from the first character in the string to the total length of the string that we specify out here. Now we'll use this previous getRandomNumber function to randomly choose a number between 1 and 2. Both these numbers are assigned to an option, option 1 and option 2. If this function generates 1, which is option 1, we will return a randomly generated number from 0 to 9. And if this function returns 2, which corresponds to our option 2, it will return a randomly generated uppercase alphabet. And to exercise these options, let's create a select case statement. First, let's end select. Let's go with option 1. I'll just add a comment for what it does. So this will generate a number between 0 and 9, which we'll assign to our single string variable. We'll use the getRandomNumber function. Lower bound 0, upper bound 9. This will return an integer. We need to convert it to a string. Let's do that. This CS star function converts any expression, including a number, to a string. Now let's go for option 2. This will generate an alphabet. We've already seen this function before. So each iteration of this loop will return a single string value, which will either be a number or an uppercase alphabet. And we will take that single value and construct our full string value. So a full string will be the current value of the full string and whatever value is generated by the single string. In the first iteration, the initial value of full string will be blank. So the final full string value will just be the single string value that we create above out here. And in the next iteration, it will be the previous single string value that we've carried forward from the previous iteration of the loop and the new single string value that we generate right above out here. So that's how we will construct the full alphanumeric value. And finally, let's assign the function to return the value of the full string. Save this. So let's see if this runs. We'll just generate it from the main code. Debug.print. Let's generate an 8-character string. Play this out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Perfect. So that works well. Moving on. Okay, so now we have returned to our main code. We're going to finally start our loop. And what we're going to do is iterate over each column and create the logic as per our rule requirements. First up is the date column. Our condition here is that we want any random date between today and 2 years before today. So let's first find the date that's 2 years before today, or rather 730 days before today. To do that, first let's just declare a variable, and we'll set the initial date outside the for loop. To get the date, we'll just use the date add function. The interval is days. Here we are not adding, we're rather subtracting 730. And we want to subtract from the current date, which is just the date function. Forgot an I out here. Now let's go to our loop. So for the first column, date will be in column A and the current row, which is I. We want a random date between this initial date and today. So we'll again use the date add function. The interval is days. Now the trick out here is to add a random number between 0 and 730. And how do we do that? We'll just use our get random number function. Lower bound is 0 and upper bound is 730. And the date is basically the initial date. Okay, let's save this and let's test it out. Hit play. Go back to our main sheet. Okay, we have dates populated out here. The way to check if the range is correct is we'll just filter. So today's date is 17 July 2023. So our earliest date starts in July 21. So this seems to be working correctly. Wow. Moving on. Next up, we're going to generate a random invoice number between 10,000 and 19,999. The catch here is that it needs to be unique. The way to check for that is to create a dictionary and populate it with each random value that gets assigned to column B. But before assigning the value, we will first check whether that value already exists in the dictionary through a previous iteration of the loop. Let's head on over to our code. First, let's create the dictionary. We're going to use late binding. Let's also create a Boolean variable. This Boolean value will be false at the start. And for each iteration of the for loop, we will initialize a do until loop. The do until loop will keep generating random numbers and checking whether they already exist in the dictionary. If they don't, or in other words, if we find a unique number, we will turn the Boolean variable to true, and this will stop the do loop. Let's get inside our main for loop. We're working on column 2. Let's create the do until loop, which will break when the Boolean variable turns true. So do until unique CRM is true. Close the loop. First, we'll get a random number. So get a random number between 10,000 and 19,999. If this number doesn't already exist in the dictionary, then we'll add it to the dictionary. So if not exists, the drawback of using late binding is that we don't get IntelliSense, but no worries. So if what not exists, so if the random number does not exist, then close the if. So if it doesn't exist, we will add it to the dictionary first. The dictionary takes a key, which will be the random number. It also needs a value. We'll just leave the value as 0 because we're not really going to use it. And after we've added it to the dictionary, we'll assign it to the cell in column B. So the current cell in column B will equal to the random number. And finally, since we found a random number, which is unique, we can set this Boolean value to true. This will ensure that we exit out of the loop. And once we've exited out of the loop, we will just set this back to false so that we can run this loop in the next iteration. So just to go over this one more time, this do until loop will keep searching for a random number that doesn't exist in the dictionary. And how is the dictionary populated? It is populated by all the random numbers that are generated from the previous iterations of the for loop. So let's save this and test it out. That ran. Great. Everything seems to be populated. Our lowest number is 10,000 and our highest number is 1 less than 20,000, which is correct. Awesome. Moving on. Next up is the store name. We have a list for this already on our sheet random list. So our objective is to randomly select a store from this list. Go back to our code. We'll first put the list into a dynamic array. And in order to do that, we first need to find the last row. Now I could have just hard coded it to 11, but let's get a bit fancy and find the last row dynamically. And we find the last row by finding the first populated cell from the bottom up. Let's create a variable for the dynamic array and populate the array. So this will be from the second row down to the last row, which in our case will be row 11. Okay, let's go into our loop. We are working on column 3. Let's generate a random number using our custom function. I can just copy it from here. But now the lower bound of the function will be the lower bound of our dynamic array. And the upper bound of the function will be the upper bound of the dynamic array. So the lower bound of the dynamic array is 1 and the upper bound is 10, which is the count 10. So this will generate a random number between the upper bound and the lower bound of the array. We can then use this number as the array index number to pick a value from the array. So let's assign the output first to the current cell in column C. And the value will be the value of the array where the index is the random number. Okay, that's it. Let's test this out. I've saved it. Let's hit play. Go back to our sheet. Cool. Everything seems to be populating well. Before moving on, just want to point out that this was the bulk of the logic. The rest of the columns are just slight variations of what we have covered so far. We'll cover them quickly, and it'll also be a good opportunity to recap what we have done so far. The next column is the customer code. Let's head on over to our main code. We're working on column 4. So we want our output to look something like this. Just the last 4 digits will be randomly generated. And this first part will be a constant string. So what we're going to do out here is join the constant string to a randomly generated 4-digit number. And we'll assign it to the current value of column D. The first part is the constant string. And the next part is the randomly generated number. Since it's a 4-digit number, we're going to place it between 1000 and 9999. Next up is the original amount. This is just a random number between 5000 and 20,000. We're working on column 5 and we'll assign the value to the current value in column E. And this is just a random number between 5000 and 20,000. Make some more space here. Next is the open amount. This is the invoice value that is still unpaid by the customer. So it can be anywhere between 1 and the original invoice amount for that particular row. We're working on column 6. We're going to assign the value to the current cell in column F. We'll use the get random number function again. The lower bound will be 1 and the upper bound will be the original invoice amount. And what is the original invoice amount? Well, it's the value that we just generated right up here. I'm just going to copy it. Next up is the ERP invoice number. This is going to be a unique 8-digit alphanumeric string. We have already created a function for this to return an alphanumeric string of a specified length. And we also know how to create unique random numbers. So let's merge all that knowledge together. First, we can set up the dictionary like we did before. And we'll create a Boolean variable to check for unique values. Going back into the loop, we're in column 7. We're going to basically copy this same logic as before. So this is where we generated unique random numbers. And we just need to replace the word CRM with ERP. The safest way to do this would be to use the replace function. Find what CRM, and what are we going to do with it? We want to replace it with ERP. Make sure the radio button for selected text is selected, and we'll hit replace all. Okay, that is changed. We'll change random number to random value, because we will not be returning a number, we'll be returning a string. I should have just used the find and replace function, but this is fun as well. And for the last bit, we're not generating a random number. We are creating a random alphanumeric string, which has a length of 8. And finally, we are assigning the value to column G. Okay, let's play this out before continuing on. So we generated the customer code. It's correct. Original amount, open amount. The open amounts look correct. They are lesser than the original amount. And the ERP invoice number is an 8-character string, which is looking correct as well. Okay, all that's remaining is the source and the CRM reference code. So the column source is going to tell us whether the customer purchased the goods over the counter in the store or picked it up from an online order. And we'll use the same logic as we did in store name. So let's create a variable for an array to hold the source list, grab the last row, and populate the array. So we're basically doing the same thing as we did up here. You can just copy this down. And we're just going to change store to source. Just going to do it manually. And that's the problem. If you do it manually, you land up messing up the code. Okay, that, and we're assigning the value to column H. That looks good. And last, we have the CRM reference column. These are just some made up reference codes. We're going to use the same logic as we did out here. Just did all of that to make the data look a bit more realistic. We'll do the same thing, create an array, find the last row, and populate the array. And doing the exact same thing as we did above out here. Okay, let's save and run. It's the last part that we added. 2 values and the CRM reference code with 3 values. All looks correct. Great, and that's a wrap. We've just created a data set that I'm going to use in my future videos. And that's it for this video. Hope you enjoyed the session. If you did, please do like and subscribe. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next one.